Now, how many of you hunt in hills, hill countries, whitetails and hills? There's probably more out there than you might realize. You look at the majority of Wisconsin has hills, majority of Pennsylvania. There's a lot of states that you could throw into this mix that have hills of some type. And I'm talking 20, 30 foot elevation changes on a property, 40 acres in size or larger, where you have to deal with thermals and hills and how deer move through hills. Count yourself blessed if you hunt in hill country. What I found is everything being equal, hills push up age structure, separates hunters, separates deer, allows a mature buck to get into some flat somewhere back in a hill and truly age because he's protected from hunters. If a hunter comes over the top of the ridge, they spook him. They come up from the bottom, they spook him. I began hunting in hills in Pennsylvania in 1993. It's a long time ago. And over there, they had 700 to 800 foot changes in elevation. And you know, for a kid coming out of Michigan, flat land, was 23 years old, it was certainly a learning curve, but it was fun because I found I can find this little hollow that you just sit on a ridge top and watch, and you're 2 hours from the car. And you could sit back there and you have this place to yourself. You know, that intrigued me right off the bat because I could put some effort into it and get way back there away from other hunters. And again, separating hunters to the point where, you know, those guys out in Pennsylvania deer camp, they would walk all day, still hunt. You know, nothing wrong with that. And there was a lot of deer back in those days. It was nothing to see 30, 40 deer come through the hollow in one herd. A couple little spikes or 4-point, and there's so many deer, it's hard to even get a shot. But I actually would hunt to where I'd sit. And, you know, coming from Michigan, that's what we did. We had small properties. We couldn't just move all over the place. It wasn't long before you're across another fence row and another fence row, and you're on 3 neighbors over now. So I sat until dark. It was over 2 hours back to the truck. So I had to walk all the way back. I'm pulling in to camp, and they're coming out in the driveway with a carload of guys to come look for me. Because there's this flatlander from Michigan. Obviously, I'm dead out there somewhere. I'm lost. But they just hunted different. They'd already had dinner, completed the dishes, and they were all geared up, ready to come find me. So that was my first introduction to hills. And boy, you know, I'm hunting on this side of the hollow, and I'm spooking deer over there, even though the wind's in my face. I didn't understand it all. But I have to study things like that. It doesn't matter in life and anything. You always ask yourself why. You can't just take it at face value that if you do this, this happens. Understand why when you do this, this happens. And now you actually truly learn. And that's the same with wind and thermals. So I like hunting hills. It's a huge advantage. Older buck age structure. You mix hills with ag land, and boy, you know, recipe for great bucks and great deer herds. I'm going to start just number one. First point here, really important to understand, is thermals go up in the morning, they go down in the evening. But that's not equal. See, thermals change with the temperature. So if the temperature continues to climb at daybreak, meaning when the sun comes up, that's when the temperatures go up. A lot of times at daybreak, before the sun's up, that's the coldest time of the day. Thermals are still just hanging low. So you can saturate the ground below you. But as soon as the sun pops up and the temperature goes up, those thermals go uphill. And that temperature might be going up till 2, 3 in the afternoon. So if you're on a ridge top, those thermals will continue to climb till that time when they level off. Then when they level off, you'll experience more of the true wind if you don't have any earth in the way or soil to wrap that around, which we'll talk about down here in saddles and points and ridges. Then the evening, thermals go down. Unfortunately, a lot of people go to a stand location, they have 3 hours to sit in the afternoon, and they think, well, it's going to go downhill the whole time. It's afternoon. It's not the case, folks. They go downhill for when the temperature's changing, which doesn't take place, so sometime during the last hour, typically, unless there's a front coming through. But just normal progression of daytime temperatures, you can expect those thermals to go downhill for the last 45 minutes, half hour, maybe an hour at the most. But what do you do for the other hours of the sit? You have to plan accordingly for those. But that's just some general information on thermals. I love hills and thermals so much that my 4th web class we've created that's coming out around right now is our hills and thermal web class. There's a lot of detail in there. We have about 18 videos. It's very lengthy, and it's meant for you that are hunting in hills where clients don't understand the hills and thermals to the point where they just go hunt, you know, and you're missing so much opportunity. And part of that's because you can cheat the wind. So we'll talk about that. But in the web class, I go over all these different details. There's so much to hunting in hills and thermals. Hope you guys can check it out. If not, you know, I have a hills and thermal playlist that you can check out for free. So if you want great detail, then check out the web class. It goes through a progression of how to read this. We actually go from stand to stand to stand location and actually illustrate those on the board with drone footage, with HuntWise mapping, so we can look at a lot of different ways for you to understand why the wind's moving in a certain direction, so you can apply it to your own hunt. Because this stuff is pretty black and white for the most part. We try to take a lot of the gray out and make it more defined for you in that web class. So check it out, the link's in the description. But again, you can cheat the wind. That's what's the great advantage of hunting in hills. How do you do that? Here's a ridge system right here, coming down. Wind is going that way, the true wind, the wind forecast, let's say it's out of the west. That means if you have a deer on a bench down here that is traveling in this area right here, and you have a stand location right here, then when that wind comes over, even though this is the true direction, it's going to lift and come back uphill. So now you can hunt with the wind at your back. You can also hunt if the wind's coming this way, obviously. So you can a lot of times hunt 180 degrees in the same stand location, which isn't possible without those hills and without those thermals taking place. So in the morning, thermals going up. Now in the evening, if you're sitting in that stand, it spills down below, unless you have a strong wind in your face. So you have to know the difference between morning and evening, but you can really cheat the wind. And if the wind's coming at an angle, if that wind is coming over my left shoulder, then it's going to tail back uphill to the right. It's coming over my right shoulder with my back to the upper elevation. It's coming over my right shoulder, then it's going to tail up to the left. So if you have a bedding area over that way, you better make sure the wind's not coming this way, or it's going to hit that bedding area 200 yards over there eventually. So all those things we go over in the web class, of course, but just know that you can cheat the wind. You can't do that on flat ground. If the wind's in your face, it's in your face. Now there's sometimes, if there's conifer thickets, if there's berms, ditches, that might move the wind a little bit, especially the conifer. But for the most part, the wind is what you have, what the forecast is. So you don't get to cheat it, which stinks, because there's a lot of times in the morning we can hunt certain stands and know that we can get away with a lot in the morning. That's how I shoot a lot of my bucks. I just have to be above them. Pretty simple tip. Evening, it's a little bit more complex because, again, you have to account for the wind is dropping the last 45 minutes, but it's not the first 2 to 3 hours of the sit. So you really have to take that into account. Flats rule. What do I mean by that is where deer bed, where bucks bed in general. And where do bucks bed, by the way, we actually have a whole class on this. Pretty easy. If food's at the top, they bed toward the bottom. If food's at the bottom, they bed towards the top. Don't let anyone ever tell you they bed in the top third, the top 20%, the military crest, all these fancy terms or guidelines, throw them out the window. If there's food high, they bed low. If there's food low, they bed high. If there's food high and low, they bed in the middle. If there's enough room left over. If there's enough thick cover. So pretty black and white on that. But they're going to bed in a flat. They're not bedding on that steep angle. Deer move on flats. They bed on flats. So when you take all that steep area out of the equation, it really narrows down exactly where deer are going to move. They're going to move on flats. A lot of times they're moving on the top of a ditch where there's a flat. They're moving across saddles, which is a low point and a ridge. They're moving around points on a flat or a bench that extends around that point. And then they're moving along ridge lines on a bench on the side of the ridge, usually not right on the very top. But they focus on flats. So when you put it all together, you can look at public land on a topo and say they're going to move from this flat to this flat to this flat. They're going to go from this flat and this point to this flat, and they're going to follow this big bench that wraps around the inside of a hollow to get there. So you can pretty much look at a topo map and so, yeah, they're going to use these flats. Where those topo lines are further apart, that's where there's a bench, that's where there's a flat. Where they're tighter together, that's where there's a steep area within that. So you can really, really dictate in hill country. Not only can you cheat the wind, but you can say, hey, this 70% of the land the deer aren't going to live in or move in regularly because it's too steep. Focus on those flats. South-facing food. Go out on public land. Just about any south-facing slope has a higher diversity of habitat, more regeneration, more stem count, which equals more food and diversity of food. A lot of times you find sheds on the south-facing slope, not because deer are bedding there, soaking up the sun like we like to on a beach. They're there because there's a higher percentage of food than the north-facing slope that's shaded out. But rest assured, if the south winds, which are usually the stable winds in your area, meaning they're 35% winds, southerly in some way, if you just had a temperature drop from 25 down to 12 degrees, And the next day it's 14, the next day it's 17 degrees, and you have 20-mile-an-hour winds coming out of the south because it's beginning to warm up. Those deer are not going to sit on that south-facing slope no matter how much sun there is because they're exposed to the wind. They actually go on the shady side to bed, even if they go back on the south side to actually feed and move around under the cover of darkness. So never think, well, they're bedding on that south-facing slope or I have to hunt that. There might be more food there, and that especially applies for public land. But they need to get out of the wind during the wintertime, especially those cold months of November, December, January. That's why I say not bedding. There's so many other details that come into bedding, meaning food, doe bedding, then buck bedding. That can happen in any direction, north or south. We find a lot of our best bedding areas that I know of personally are north-facing. It just happens to be that way. But we know some outstanding north-facing bedding areas just simply because they're left alone and it's adjacent to food and there's does up top or down below to give you that pattern of food, does, and then bucks. And it doesn't matter if it's up and down, north, south, east, west. If you have those conditions taking place and you have adequate bedding cover, then you can follow that system pretty easily for where bucks bed. Finally, ditches, saddles, points, ridges. Always remember that the wind moves through the terrain similar to water. So think about in the evening, if your wind's blowing side across the hill, going down at an angle, and then it hits a draw or a ditch that goes down, it's going to follow that. You can count on that. So if deer are coming up that ditch, 100 yards down, and they're crossing out in front of you, you could literally be facing this way. It's downhill to my left. You're expecting to shoot deer on this flat right here. They're crossing that ditch. That ditch is behind me, starts 50 yards and goes downhill. My scent is blowing behind me into that ditch. Deer are crossing 100 yards down that way. My scent's going this way. But guess what? You're blowing those deer out 100 yards down because the wind's coming this way. In the evening, it hits that ditch, and then it follows the ditch downhill like water would and spooks those deer 100 yards. So I'm having wind in my face here, and I'm blowing out deer there, and I don't know why. It's because it's following that ditch line. It follows hills. It follows soil. When it hits that soil, it spins. It does all kinds of things. That's why I talk about true wind. You know, if you're on a ridge system, the ridge is going down like this, you're hunting up here above the soil, then you get true wind. Whatever direction that wind is coming from or going to, it's going to be true up there. However, if you're sitting right here below the crest, now in the morning it's going to tail back up. If it's coming uphill in the evening, but it doesn't have a lot of power, it's only 1-2 miles an hour, then it's going to stay back and go back downhill. So you really have to know these details, but the cool thing is, if you learn it in one spot, you can apply it to another. So always remember, when you're hunting, hunt flats, hunt those movements. The deer are going to be in the flats. They're going to bed in the flats. They're going to move in the flats. Always remember that the thermals can go uphill. It will stay up, and as long as you're above the deer in the morning, you're probably safe till 1, 2, 3 in the afternoon. And remember, if you're counting on evening thermals, you can only count on them for the last 45 minutes of daylight. If you remember those basic things, that'll get you in the right direction. There's a whole lot more details. Again, I urge you to check out our web class for Honey's Hills and Thermals. It's a huge advantage for you. And that's why a lot of the best whitetail states in the country and the best counties in the country are specifically located in areas with a lot of hills. You know, and you look at Eastern Ohio, incredible place, Southern Ohio, anywhere from 100 to 300 to 400 foot changes in elevation. Get into West Virginia, Kentucky. Outstanding areas, Western Illinois versus Eastern Illinois, Southern Indiana versus Northern Indiana, Western Wisconsin versus Eastern Wisconsin. Now, I'm not saying there's not other good locations in these spots. For example, Western Wisconsin being better than Eastern. There's some outstanding bucks to the east. The point is, where you get into the hills and push the age structure up, separates deer from hunters, and your potential is higher, no different than southeast Minnesota, eastern Iowa, and all the way down the line, back and forth. Where you get those hills, where you find hills, you find great whitetail herd, you find ways to cheat the wind, and you can really hone in on your success and learn these traits of how wind moves in hills and thermals, how deer move in hills, and outstanding way to take advantage of great whitetail areas. And everything being equal, I'd always choose to hunt in hills. It's really an advantage for you. You just have to learn how to do it. It's not a guessing game. You just have to learn these details. So I hope this makes sense to you. Again, I urge you to check out the web class or just my Hills and Thermal playlist if you want it all for free. We'll go into a lot more detail in the web class and a lot more illustration. But thanks again for watching to the end. I appreciate you guys. Appreciate the comments, the feedback down below. And heck, most of our hunting's in hills and thermals around here. So we get to do this stuff all the time, plan for it. And if you plan with the right strategies and tips in the right direction with hills, hill country, it'll set yourself apart from your neighbors. You'll be able to build a good herd and certainly enjoy your passion like we do of whitetail hunting to an even higher level this fall and beyond.